Who would Sun Tzu predict to win the U.S. war in Afghanistan? And how would he make that assessment? Hi, I'm John LeMay, and welcome to my Basement War Room. This is the third video in the Great Military Philosophers on Afghanistan series. And today I'm going to talk about Sun Tzu's first chapter on assessments. After I go over that a bit, then I'll talk about some similarities in U.S. Army doctrine. And then finally, I'll apply Sun Tzu's methodology to the Afghan war. So let's go ahead and jump into it. Okay, Sun Tzu on assessments. Therefore, to gauge the outcome of war, we must appraise the situation on the basis of the following 5 criteria and compare the two sides by assessing their relative strengths. So the 5 criteria are the way, which talks about the alignment of the people to their leadership. It also talks about the willingness to die. Climate, weather, light, the seasons, terrain, lay of the land, distances. Command, the qualities in the commander of wisdom, integrity, humanity, courage, discipline. And regulation, organizational effectiveness, logistics, the chain of command. So these are Sun Tzu's 5 criteria to assess two opposing forces. And it strikes me as very similar to U.S. Army doctrine. So now that we've looked at this, let's take a brief look at some U.S. Army doctrine. So U.S. Army doctrine, the military decision-making process, step 9. And immediately, some of you who are familiar with this may say, hey, but John, there's only 7 steps. Well, you're right. This would be Step 2, mission analysis. Sub-step 2, intelligence preparation of the battlefield. Sub-step 2, describe battlefield effects. However, having gone through all the sub-steps and sub-sub-steps many times, they all felt like steps to me. Now that I'm retired, I'm just going to call it Step 9. Okay, so that's terrain and weather. And it is, of course, very similar to climate and terrain that Sun Tzu talked about. But even more similar is Step 26, analyze relative combat power. So in this, U.S. Army doctrine, the military decision-making process says, hey, assess the ratio of forces, compare force ratios between the two opposing sides. It's more a mathematical assessment. And then do a more subjective assessment of each side's strengths and weaknesses based on the elements of combat power, which for the U.S. Army are intelligence, movement and maneuver, fires, sustainment, protection, mission command. Those are the warfighting functions, plus information and leadership. So here they are. And these strike me as very similar categories to what Sun Tzu suggested. There's a lot of overlap there. And the methodology is very similar. So as I read Sun Tzu, I immediately thought, hey, I've seen this before. I've seen it in Army doctrine. And either Army doctrine was inspired by it, or as a sort of affirmation, it was developed in parallel many centuries later through the Army's experience in war. Okay, so we talked a little bit about U.S. Army doctrine. Now let's go back to Sun Tzu's framework and apply Sun Tzu's framework to the war in Afghanistan. So what I have here is Sun Tzu's framework applied to Afghanistan. So category, I've got the way, climate, terrain, command, regulation, U.S. and their allies, Taliban and their allies, and the final category over there is who has the advantage. Now when I first thought about this, I said, hey, U.S. Army, Taliban, advantage, and everything, U.S. Army, it's so clear. But as you step back a little bit, the U.S. military, the Army and military, all of it, has actually, over the last 18 years, done a small fraction of the fighting. Most has been done by the allies, particularly the Afghan National Security Defense Forces. So really, a fair assessment is the combination of the U.S., NATO, the Afghan National Security Defense Forces versus Taliban, Haqqani Network, Al-Qaeda, and any other terrorist alliances that they've had working in Afghanistan. So it's really comparing the U.S. and allies versus Taliban and allies. Okay, jumping into it. The way. Strength, the U.S. home front. Often, people, including myself, say, we didn't apply the lessons of Vietnam. And that's not accurate. A much more accurate statement is, we only applied a few of the lessons of Vietnam. Probably none of the counterinsurgency lessons, but shortly after the Vietnam War ended, a major step was taken to align the home front in a future war, which was to go to the all-volunteer force. So the draft was gotten rid of. And so the combination of September 11th, the American people watching the planes go into the towers, watching the towers fall, not having a draft, having just an all-volunteer force, and not having taxes for the war, has led to a very strong home front and support in the U.S. for the war effort. So that's a strength. Weakness is the Afghan people. Frankly, we can't tell the difference between the Taliban and anyone else in Afghanistan, especially other Pashtun tribal members. So the inability to discriminate. Also, the Afghan people, many of them do not support the Afghan National Defense Security Forces or their government. So there's very low alignment there. I want to talk about this last point after I talk about the Taliban. So let me go over here and look at the Taliban and their allies. The first thing about the Taliban to really focus in on is that they are a Pashtun movement, an ethnic movement. Many categorize them as an Islamic movement. And that's a little bit like saying that some... The analogy is not that great, but saying like some party maybe that's rebelling against the United States and the United States is a constitutional movement, or some party that says that we're into the Constitution is a constitutional movement. Well, most all Americans support the U.S. Constitution. It has great buy-in across everyone. So what really are the differences between the movement here? So going back to, again, not a perfect analogy, but going back to Afghanistan, everyone's a Muslim. Like almost everyone's a Muslim. So saying the Taliban is an Islamic movement, is fighting all these other Muslims, doesn't make much sense. Now they do have a great origin narrative. The origin narrative of, hey, they were Tali students of Islam, and these students of Islam came across this great wrong, warlords and bad actors doing terrible things to the people, and they applied Sharia law to make it right, and then the people elevated them into governance because they wanted security and wanted to be ruled by these students. I mean, that's a great origin narrative, but really the Taliban are a Pashtun movement, an ethnic movement of the Pashtun people, primarily. So the strength they have is the Pashtun people. They have broad support from the Pashtun people. The Code of Pashtunwali is also something that helps align the people and the Taliban and makes them willing to die for a cause. So they have great strengths there. Weaknesses, all other ethnic groups in Afghanistan. If you go back before the U.S. intervention, when the Northern Alliance was battling the Taliban, that's loosely all other ethnic groups in Afghanistan against the Pashtuns. So, okay, so we talked about Taliban strengths and weaknesses. Let's come back to this one, the overlay of the Western military system on Afghanistan. That is a huge weakness for the Afghan National Defense Security Forces. Okay, to sort of highlight this, let me tell you a story. And this story has happened many, many, many times in Afghanistan. And it goes that there's 30 Afghan National Security Defense Force soldiers out on a combat outpost somewhere, securing a line of communication, a road or something. They're out on an outpost. And 3 Taliban engage them and rout them. And so how do 3 rout 30? Well, the first thing to know about this little story is that that's 30 privates, because all the Afghans that have been chosen to be officers and non-commissioned officers have used their position of privilege to go back to a larger, more secure base with more amenities and are not out on a desolate combat outpost. And that is, I mean, that's just how they've taken rank to their culture. It's about privilege, not responsibility. So the second thing to know is It's desolate. These outposts are largely HESCO barriers filled with sand. They have often in short supply, so it sort of sucks to be out there. And then the third thing is the way the 3 Taliban show up and rout these 30 soldiers is they'll probably fire a few shots to get their attention, but then they immediately go into having a dialogue with them. And it's a 2-track dialogue. The first track is with all the other people. And so I may have skipped over this a little bit, but the Afghan National Security Defense Forces are built from all parts of Afghanistan. So all ethnic groups, all geographic locations, they're brought together, made into a unit, and then sent somewhere, random in Afghanistan. And so to the non-local soldiers, the Taliban will have the dialogue of, hey, we've got a one-time special deal, get out of here, run away, and you get to live. If not, we're going to come back with 100 of our best friends and kill you all you foreigners, all you non-Pashtun ethnic or people that are from a different part of Afghanistan. And so that's one narrative. And then with a few that are more local or have some sort of tribal connection, like, hey, brothers, we have these cousins in common, we have these tribal affiliations in common. Why are you standing next to these foreigners, these other ethnicities, these people from other parts of Afghanistan and fighting us? Come and join us. And so what will typically happen is a few of those 30 will defect to the Taliban, the rest will run away, and it's 3 Taliban have routed 30 Afghan National Defense Security Forces. So the way is not with the Afghan National Defense Security Forces. They're not aligned with their leaders, and they're not willing to die for their cause. Advantage, Taliban. Okay, climate. This case is a little bit more clear-cut. It's a very much a case of 21st century versus 12th century, and the advantage goes to the 21st century. The U.S. and NATO are an all-weather, all-climate, day and night force and have command of air and space. The Taliban is tied to fighting seasons. It's very difficult for a guerrilla force to have any kind of sustainment in the mountains of Afghanistan during the winter. I will point out, though, they've improved through necessity, through having a all-weather, all-climate, all-season force come at them constantly, and all-weather, all-seasons, and all climates. They've gotten better, but still clearly an advantage to the U.S. Okay, terrain. So strength for the U.S. is engineering capabilities, building roads, building lines of communication, and very importantly, command of air and space. Weakness, high altitude operations. Really, the Chinook is one of the only helicopters that can operate at altitude in Afghanistan. So a lot of the inventory is challenged by those kinds of operations. But a more important weakness is just that we actually need those lines of communications. So it's great that we can build the roads, but we need those roads. There's a reason why the 4 operating bases are all in airfields, and we put a lot of effort into building roads and infrastructure. And that just sets up places for guerrillas to attack. So weakness is we actually need those lines of communication. Taliban strength is sanctuary in Pakistan. It's a huge advantage. Now, many people, and partially justifiably, are very upset with Pakistan for providing this sanctuary. But it's important to realize that Pakistan and Afghanistan are a little bit artificial. I mean, really, what we're talking about is Pashtunistan. So there is Pashtunistan, and the Brits cut it in half, and half of it went into Afghanistan. It's not all of Afghanistan, and half of it went into Pakistan. It's not all of Pakistan, but Pashtunistan got cut in half, and the Pashtun people don't really recognize that. They operate freely, and the fact that we're sort of tied to a fiction that there's Afghanistan and Pakistan works to their advantage. So the Pashtun people that happen to live in Pakistan provide a lot of support and sanctuary to the Taliban, who are Pashtuns. So that sanctuary is a great strength. They're acclimatized, they're able to live off the land and the population. So we compare all this, advantage, Taliban. Okay, command. The U.S. has professional militaries. NATO has professional militaries. We have a West Point to the War College. We have the non-commissioned officer corps, the envy of the world, the backbone of the U.S. Army. So very professional militaries. That's our strength. However, the weakness is the Afghan National Defense Security Forces leadership. They are very weak. They're not professional. And I'll just tell another little story to sort of highlight this. So one of the most successful Afghan National Defense Security Force leaders was General Razik. Now, he was assassinated, and he survived many assassination attempts, but finally the Taliban got him. But while he was alive, he was the chief of police of Kandahar, and he was very successful. And some of the things that made him successful is, one, because he was a police chief and not tied to this national army, he recruited locally. He could have tribal and local and ethnic uniformity. He didn't have to have all that diverse formation operating together, so he could be uniformed that way. Also, he went in on the cult of personality. His police officers all ran around wearing patches with a big picture of him on it. Can you sort of imagine like Patton's Third Army all running around wearing a patch with Patton's picture on it? It's not Western. It's not U.S. military tradition to do things like that, but worked very well for Razik. So he had a very effective police force to the extent that the Army Corps, the Afghan National Defense Security Force, like their Army Corps in Kandahar would get in serious trouble and be routed, and the Kandahar police, not Kandahar, in Helmand would be in serious trouble, and the Kandahar police would, go forth and save the army in Helmand. So his effectiveness just highlights the weakness of the rest of the Afghan National Defense Security Forces. They have very poor leadership. Okay, over here to the Taliban, strength. They have very strong leaders. They have tribal affiliation, tribal loyalty, code of Pashtunwali. They work very well, and they're actually committed to learning from the U.S. At many points in the war, we'll get excited about things like, oh, they've captured our night vision devices. They might develop a night capability, which in time they certainly did. But much more significant was downloading U.S. Army doctrine off the internet and reading it and applying it and using it. So they worked hard, learned from us, and became much more professional over time. Okay, one weakness, though, for the Taliban is turnover and leadership. The leadership was highly targeted, and they took a lot of casualties. They had a high leadership turnover over the 18 years. Many leaders in the Taliban were killed. So, here in command, advantage, Taliban. I can't stress, when you look at this, U.S. and NATO are great, but the vast majority of the force is Afghan, and the Afghan National Defense Security Forces had very poor leaders. Okay, regulation. So, again, U.S. NATO forces, very professional, very regulated, and, there are some Afghan units, like the commandos, that are strong. And the reason they are is because units like the commandos are supervised, trained, work closely with special operations forces. So U.S. and NATO special operations forces have their hands very much in them, and they've developed good forces there. So those are well regulated. However, all other, as I've stressed, Afghan National Defense Security Forces are weak. Not regulated, they're a weakness. Okay, looking over here to the Taliban, their strength is they're very disciplined about guerrilla operations. They're able to live off the land, get sustainment from the people, move through the difficult terrain, and they're highly effective. Their weakness is they can't mass. So when they mass, then because the U.S. and NATO have command of air and space, we can identify them and destroy them. And that forces them to be in dispersed operations. If you want to sort of think about that, think about 88 Days to Kandahar and how, but when we started off the invasion, we basically just paired air power with the Northern Alliance. And the Taliban's conventional force against the Northern Alliance's conventional force, when they met for battle, the U.S. just destroyed the Taliban conventional force from the air. So they can't mass because then they'll be destroyed. They'll be identified and destroyed. So they have to remain small, dispersed guerrilla operations that are hard to identify. However, they're very good at that kind of decentralized operations is what they're very good at. So again, advantage Taliban. So I'm saying Sun Tzu would say, hey, the Taliban's going to win. Now the immediate sort of response is, well, okay, this is 2020. And it's also through a thick lens of my biases, my experience. And so it's not the same as doing an assessment. And it's not, right? We're looking back over 18 years, 2020 hindsight. But I do think that some elements of this are absolutely fair to say, hey, we could have done this assessment using this criteria in advance. Like we could have said, hey, is a Western military system really going to overlay on Afghan culture while they're fighting a civil war, an insurgency, while they're in combat effectively? Is that in the near term going to produce an effective force? That kind of discussion, analysis, and the answer being no, it's not, could have been looked at before any serious involvement. We didn't need 18 years of hindsight to sort of come to that conclusion. Another one, sanctuary in Pakistan. Shouldn't be a surprise to anyone before this thing really kicked off that Pashtunistan straddles both Afghanistan and Pakistan, and that the Taliban are Pashtuns and are going to get a lot of support from there. So I think that could have also very fairly been done without 18 years of experience in hindsight. So yes, this is a 2020 exercise, but I think elements of this could absolutely be done without any hindsight. Okay, talked a little bit about applying Sun Tzu's assessment framework from his first chapter to the Afghan war. Okay, and now let's go ahead and conclude. So today, we talked about Sun Tzu's first chapter, assessments, its similarity to U.S. Army doctrine, and then applied it to the Afghan war. I wanted to leave you with one final thought here, though. So at the end of assessments, Sun Tzu writes, "Now the general who wins a battle makes many calculations in his temple ere the battle is fought. The general who loses a battle makes but few calculations beforehand. Thus do many calculations lead to victory, and few calculations lead to defeat." So, in the spirit of many calculations leading to victory, the U.S. Army has developed a 50-some step military decision-making process, every one of those steps requiring many, many, many calculations. And I just question, is Sun Tzu right in this? Do more calculations always produce a better result? Or at some point, is there diminishing returns? Are our commanders, our generals, really doing the military decision-making process, or are they going to some pro forma meetings, taking some briefings, and letting sort of the staff churn through our very bureaucratized system of military decision-making? I sort of think that there might be a sweet spot in between. Sun Tzu was writing from an era when there was almost no professionalism and no calculations, and urging people to take it more seriously. And so that's one side. And the other side of the equation is, hey, a bureaucracy taking control of the process to the point that maybe some thought is actually getting driven out. And perhaps the sweet spot's in the middle. I just, maybe 25 steps in the MDMP instead of 50 some. Okay, so if this has been let me cover some references first. Okay, first reference here, FM50, 2005 version. This has MDMP in it. I like it because I can touch it, it's a book. However, it's a bit dated, so you can find the current version, FM60, which has MDMP, the 2014 version, online on the U.S. Army Publishing Directorate. And as a sort of an aside, I encourage all Americans, spend some time going to the U.S. Army Publishing Directorate and take a look at Doctrine. Now, Doctrine can be difficult and annoying to read, but the modern Doctrine actually has a logic chart and a pretty good summary in just a couple pages right up front in each of the thick online publications. And we are a nation at war. You are spending, I mean, the American people are spending billions on the U.S. Army. It may be worth your time to take a look, see what's written there, and because we're a republic, you can write someone if you think there's some, if you have an opinion on that. It's worth having an opinion on that stuff. Okay, that was a little bit aside. Back to references. Also, the Smart Book, 5th edition, that summarizes U.S. Army doctrine, and you gotta have a summary if you have 50-some steps in MDMP, right? And The Art of War, this is the Giles translation. I read from it at the end, but primarily I used the Ames translation on my Kindle. So, thank you for joining me today. If this has been of value, please like and follow on social media. These videos are on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. If you want a little bit more information, get a little bit more behind the scenes, go to the website and sign up for the newsletter, which will come out monthly. That's at thebasementwarroom.com. And finally, please comment. There were some great comments on the first video. One pointed me towards a book that I have never read before and didn't know existed, and it's wonderful to get a pointer like that. And the other point is, this is very much influenced by my experiences and this video series that is, and your experiences are just as valid. So please comment. Thank you very much for joining me.